Thank you to all of you for being here. It's really a privilege to give these talks on our topic of handing on the faith in a woke world. We're going to explore a lot of things together, a lot of challenging topics, so I ask for your good faith engagement as we do that. And to help you with that, I've got handouts for each of the sessions. If you do not have a handout, raise your hand, and Ed or Jeff will make sure you get one. So each of the handouts, I've got basically an outline to help you track through the session, okay? And then the second page are some graphic organizers that can help you sort of remember or process the information. And then the third page is a list of recommended readings and resources and so forth. So for each of the sessions, you'll go home with a handout. That way you can, jot down notes, remember things, and, something to hang your hat on when you go home. So as I deliver these talks, first off, I don't deliver them as the solution to all of our problems by any means, but as a way to try to hold up these topics to the light so that key principles can take shape so that we can navigate them successfully as Christians in the world we're facing, and as families and congregations who are in Christ and are His living body, the church. These sessions will not be political diatribes. Reality is much more complicated than either side portrays. We need to, in Luther's words, call a thing what it is. That requires doing some history, some theology, some philosophy. Then we have to go beyond that, go beyond just wringing our hands or patting ourselves on the back like we're thanking God that we're not like those people over there. We need to go past that, right? Then we have to do the hard work of looking in the mirror, seeing how we too maybe have absorbed some of these ideas and things that we decry. And then comes the even harder work of forming new habits and patterns of life in Christ. So this first session, I'm really combining what I usually do as multiple sessions into a summary of what I consider the core issues with wokeness. I've tried to boil it down to two main issues, okay? Once you see these issues, then it's like a light bulb. You see them everywhere, and you can't unsee them. Then tomorrow's session will go more into the family and the church, okay? How our Lutheran heritage can help us develop a unified approach to life where family and education, doctrine and practice all unite together. There we will see, too, there's a role for all of us, young and old, grandparents and parents, married and single, those with kids and without kids, lifelong Lutherans and Lutheran converts, woke refugees, and political exiles. Part one of each session on the outline, on all three of the sessions, I've broken them into 3 parts, okay? So that there's a basic framework for all 3. Part 1 of each session I'm calling Peeling the Onion, understanding how we got here. Okay, we got to do some background and history to understand the landscape, okay? Then part 2 of each session I've called Connecting the Dots, diagnosing the issues, all right? What are the present day manifestations that we're seeing? How can we connect the past to the present? And then part 3 of each session will be called Living the Truth, thinking rightly and practicing richly. Okay, in other words, what to do about these issues. I'm sure there'll be some things you disagree with me on. That's great. That's fine. We can engage on that in the Q&As and in between sessions if you like. I think I've got something that everybody in here will disagree with at some point. Okay, try to be equal opportunity offender. And again, I'm looking forward to the Q&As. These really, I want you to think of them as strategy sessions, right? I'm going to share a bunch of stuff with you, okay? And then we can talk about it together, okay? See what's working, what's not working, what ideas you have, what questions and so forth you have. Now, during the session, I will briefly pause after each part in the outline, okay? Just to sort of regroup and see if there's anything you need clarified. If there's just general questions, wait until the end for those. But if there's something you're unclear about, something you're hung up on, something that I didn't make clear, after each session I'll pause briefly so that you can have a chance to clarify those things before we build the argument more. Okay? Now I know that's a risk with a bunch of pastors in here to open it up during the sessions, so I'll retain the right to cut you off. Okay, so we ready for takeoff? All right, here we go. G.K. Chesterton, the great novelist, apologist, and wit of the 1900s, wrote in his book Heretics the following visionary words. The great march of mental destruction will go on. Everything will be denied. Everything will become a creed. It is a reasonable position to deny the stones in the street. It will be a religious dogma to assert them. It is a rational thesis that we are all in a dream. It will be a mystical sanity to say we are all awake. Fires will be kindled to testify that 2 and 2 make 4. Swords will be drawn to prove that leaves are green in the summer. We shall be left defending not only the incredible virtues and sanities of human life, but something more incredible still. This huge, impossible universe, which stares us in the face. We shall fight for the visible prodigies as if they were invisible. We shall look on the impossible grass and the skies with a strange courage. We shall be of those who have seen and yet have believed. What Chesterton foresaw 117 years ago was how the growing skepticism of his day would turn into dogmatic denials of reality and outright assertions of fiction. He was right. So let's see how we've descended into this woke world, where in Chesterton's words, 2 and 2 don't make 4, and where we are left defending the sanities of human life. If I had to summarize wokeness, boil it down to its most basic things, I would say it comes down to 2 things. Okay? First, wokeness assumes that the world can be boiled down to power dynamics. Oppressed and oppressor. Victim and victimizer. Second, wokeness assumes that a human being is something that is defined by the power of one's own will and lived experience. This is a constructivist view of the self, where human beings are considered autonomous and self-determining. These 2 things also help explain the origin of the term woke. When someone becomes enlightened to see power dynamics as the main story of society, where race, gender, and class lines determine everything, what's happened to them? Well, they woke up. When one finds their true self, when they live out their truth or live authentically, what's happened to them? Well, they've woke up. These are the 2 central issues of wokeness. What is the story that makes sense of the world? What is the nature of the human person? That's it. Okay? There's many other things, but if we're going to boil it down to the 2 main issues, those are 2 of the basic core problems. And you don't need to be an expert in Marxism or CRT to understand those 2 things. These are 2 things everybody can relate to. What is a human being? What is the story of the world? Wokeness assumes that a human being is constructed by the self, internal to the self, and that power dynamics are true, that they explain everything. So let's take these one by one. Okay, we're going to start with the self. This idea that the self is constructed, determined by my own will. This is everywhere. As a former teacher, it was ubiquitous in education. One simple example is how colleges train future teachers not to be a sage on the stage, but instead a guide on the side. This slogan captures the approach to education that's unfolded over the past several generations, as teachers have been increasingly trained to shift from taking an active leadership in the classroom to now being a sideline referee, with students taking center stage. This shift to guide on the side supposedly prepares students for, quote, the 21st century, when individuals will be expected to think for themselves, pose and solve complex problems. But think about that. Is this century the first century where people have had to pose and solve complex problems? And furthermore, will shifting the teacher to the side make educational outcomes improve? How can such emasculated teachers empower students to think for themselves when they have been trained to forsake their own moral and intellectual commitments? This on-the-side approach to teaching finds its origins in constructivism, the idea that learning takes place as students construct their own knowledge. Maxine Greene, a prominent educational theorist that most teacher trainees read in college, puts it this way: the teacher must make it possible for his students to create meanings in a cosmos devoid of objective meaning, to find reasons for being. From this perspective, truth, meaning, and reality aren't verifiably real, and certainly aren't revealed by God. Instead, they're constructed by the self. If this is how knowledge and meaning are constructed by the self in the classroom, it shouldn't be any surprise that this is also how it's constructed outside the classroom. Everything is merely a creation of the human will, formable, moldable, shapeable by the power of the Almighty Self. Live your truth. Express yourself. Find your purpose. Whatever makes you happy. Follow your passion. Follow your dreams. Shoot for the stars. Dream big. Change the world. Be yourself. Love yourself first. I do me. You do you. And on it goes. Constructivism contributes to these ideas, but even more insidiously cuts us off from reality and truth. And all of this leads to anything but neutral outcomes. In the classroom and in society, when constructivism is assumed, we end up with at least two things, but two of the biggest things are relativism and narcissism. When truth is found inside myself, relativism follows, and has been for decades. This is not a new problem. A Barna survey in 2002 revealed that 83% of teenagers in 2002 revealed that all truth was relative. They didn't believe there was such thing as absolute truth. 6% of teenagers in 2002 believed that truth was absolute, that there were things that were right and wrong across the board. Okay, 6%. That was 20 years ago. Hand in hand with relativism comes narcissism. And this also is well documented. In 1950, a Gallup poll asked high school seniors if they considered themselves to be a very important person. 12% said yes in 1950. 2005, same question. 80% said yes. Here's another one. 1976, a survey asked people to list their life goals. Fame ranked 15th out of 16. 2007, same survey. 51% of young people reported being famous as one of their main life goals. That was before the smartphone. So the shift is real. And just like that Greek myth of Narcissus, who was consumed by forever looking into the reflection in a shallow pool, his own reflection, we easily get trapped in the same thing. A narcissistic cycle of the self, digitally reflected and intensified by the dopamine hits of social media, notification dings, alluring screens, peer influence, and popular culture. This is the water we swim in. Cultural assumptions are overwhelmingly constructivist. Anywhere there's a school, a store, a television, an internet connection, a smartphone, the mainstream cultural narratives are catechizing us all too well. But this relativistic side of constructivism is only part of the story. That's been around for a long time, right? What we're seeing shift in more recent years is this move towards dogmatism and militancy. Now, this road has been paved also for a long time, but it's snuck up on us the last few years, hasn't it? We could point back to all sorts of things to explain how we've got here, but for our purposes, I think it's fitting to go back to the deep intellectual and moral questioning that took place after World War II, which shook people to their core. Death tolls over 80 million. Atomic bombs, POW tragedies, Holocaust horrors, Stalin's purges, Mao's cultural revolution in China that dwarfed them all with 100 million dead. And that all came on the heels of World War I, 20 years before, which had raised the same questions. How could humans do such horrible things to one another, especially in the modern civilized world? The modern 20th century, the one that was destined for progress, that was supposed to help us transcend our bloody past, has been the bloodiest century yet. It was here at the crossroads of post-war life and postmodern thinking that a growing sense of meaninglessness and powerlessness emerged. The soldiers of World War I seemed like powerless pawns in the chess game of kings, dictators, and presidents. Think of it. At the Battle of the Somme, World War I, over 1 million casualties. One battle over a few months. So too the average person was experiencing life in a more powerless way. In the industrial machine, in the corporate office, in the growing bureaucracies of the post-war world. Despite increased technological power over nature, the actual experience of individuals became less and less powerful, as if they're being acted upon by outside forces beyond their control. This was the environment in which postmodernism emerged, questioning everything, even the basic structures of truth, language, God, morality, and universal stories. All this also left a gaping spiritual hole that has been filled with all sorts of stories and ideologies held with religious fervor. One of the most common stories to fill the void is power dynamics. That life is ultimately a game of power. And that any talk of truth or right or wrong really is an attempt to manipulate others, to have power over them. Postmodernism says no story is universally true. They're all just power grabs, attempts to control. It goes like this. The story of Christianity, that's just really a power grab, to keep the masses from rebelling and instead just waiting for heaven. The story of capitalism, just a power grab too, to keep workers pushing hard to climb the ladder and not rebel against their bosses. The story of Western civilization, it's a story of dead white guys and how they accumulated power over women and minorities. Language itself, according to postmodernism, is a power game. No inherent meaning within it. And so it goes, according to postmodernism. But here's the kicker, here's the irony. How many pages filled with language did it take to explain all that? How many pages did Jacques Derrida write about how language is meaningless? How many pages did Foucault write about power dynamics when they're also arguing language doesn't mean anything? There's an inherent inconsistency within the postmodern argument. Now, all of these attempts to deconstruct things in society, to tear things down, to break apart universal stories, meaning and truth, all of that itself becomes a universal story that explains everything else. Power dynamics today is the narrative that explains everything. And it's certainly quite persuasive. Just look around. There's tons of greed, abuse of authority, and corruption. Both political parties more drawn to power than principle. Corporations accumulate power. Institutions use power to cover up scandal and malpractice. Nietzsche's prediction seems right. This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. Thus we end up with a very simplistic story of good guys versus bad guys, in a struggle for power, sort of like Star Wars. A Manichaean battle for victory, an apocalyptic approach to politics, historical figures who become punching bags for one side or the other, increased polarization, demonization, and more. But that's not what a human being is. Right? We don't walk around with good or bad stamped on our forehead. We're not flat cardboard cutouts. We're complex human beings with multiple layers, which requires a much more complex story than these simplistic hero and villain stories that we hear today. The simplistic story we hear today says those with power are evil. Those without power are good. Christianity says something different. A more nuanced, richer understanding of the world and of human nature that allows for complexity, good and evil, all contained in the same persons and in us. There is no one righteous. No, not one, says Paul, echoing the psalmist. And perhaps no modern person grasped this more fully and profoundly than the great Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was imprisoned for years in the Soviet Gulag, yet from behind the barbed wire concluded this: if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary to only separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the hearts of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil. Sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being, at various ages, under various circumstances, can be a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change. And to the name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. The depths to which Solzhenitsyn witnessed human depravity and malevolence behind the Iron Curtain led him to such potent conclusions that human evil and brokenness are not a right problem or left problem, a communist problem or democratic problem, an atheist problem or Christian problem. It's a human one. This thoroughly Christian insight, which I think, by the way, really echoes the simile, right? Simultaneously justified and sinner. This all cuts against the innate human goodness of the constructed self, and also the narratives that view the world as a simplistic power game. Much more complicated, right? Christianity offers a more nuanced perspective on human nature and the world. Wokeness, with its view of human beings as constructed selves and its narrative of power dynamics, offers no redemption. There is no escape. There is no meaning to be found in such a cynical world, problematized into oblivion. There is no empowerment to be found in individuals, trained into victimhood. Yet this is the world we find ourselves in today. Okay, so that's part one. All right, so let's pause, regroup. Any questions on that first part, where I've laid out this idea that there's two core issues with wokeness. A view of the self that says the self is internally constructed by my own will, by my own feelings, and so forth. And the other main issue being that wokeness puts forward a story of the world that says power dynamics explains everything. Any questions or clarifications on that first part of the argument? Okay, all right, we'll keep moving. Part two. Connecting the dots. With background and core issues of wokeness laid out, let's see how this unfolds in the proliferation of critical theories today, and in making the world liquid, and in making people plastic. First, a brief explanation of what we are seeing today in the realm of critical theory. This is a massive oversimplification, but I think there's a grain of truth to it, so I'm sharing. You combine postmodernism and Marxism, and you get critical theory, which trickles down to popular opinion as wokeness. Okay? And I've got that on the outline there, I believe, somewhere. Yeah. Point A of Part 2, Roman numeral 1. Marxism plus postmodernism equals critical theory, which trickles down to society as wokeness. Now, Marxism is a messy thing to try to dig into, okay? So I'm just going to try to provide a few points and sort of things you might be able to hang your hat on. We can certainly talk about this more in the Q&A if you like. Marxist genealogy can get really messy and sticky, sort of like Jerry Springer, when they try to figure out who's related to who, and then they all end up yelling at each other by the end, okay? I think sometimes we throw around the word too easily, sort of like a fallacy, where we don't like something, so we call it Marxism as sort of that's something bad, where maybe we don't fully understand if it is that or not, or even if we really understand Marxism to begin with. So I just want to provide a couple things that might help us understand here. So for Marx, the forces of history are material forces. And for him, it was the economic forces of history that explain everything. Okay? You have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Okay? Basically, the owners and the workers. And economic forces are having them at odds. Right? It's a conflict theory of history. That history essentially boils down to conflict between two groups. It doesn't matter what the two groups are. Marx said it was economic. Right? You had the workers who were in conflict with the bosses. The people who have capital and the people who don't. Right? And Marx believed that history was marching towards a revolution where the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie. Okay? So he views history completely materialistically. And I don't mean that like he liked to buy things, right? We mean material things explain everything. That there's not a realm outside of material. Okay? But what happens to Marxism is interesting. Okay? So those revolutions either didn't work or didn't materialize the way he had thought. Right? And so then you have a new group of theorists who turn Marxism somewhat to look at the realm of ideas and culture. That the revolution's not going to come in the economic realm, but maybe through a war of ideas. Okay? So this is where we get the term cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism. And again, they're okay terms, but I do think we need to be careful that we don't just throw them around all the time without understanding what we're talking about. Okay? Yes, Marxism took a cultural turn in the 1900s as postmodernism and all these changes were occurring. And that's where we get to names that maybe you have heard the last few years, or a term like the Frankfurt School, or Herbert Marcuse, or Antonio Gramsci, these names that like nobody heard of until a couple years ago, unless you were like a philosophy major or a history professor or something like that. Now all of a sudden they're being thrown all over the place, right? But those are the theorists who basically took Marx and applied it to the realm of culture. This is where we get critical theory. Okay? Now, critical theory is a big term, which then there are critical theories beneath it. Okay? Critical race theory is one critical theory. There are other critical theories. Okay? There's gender theories that are critical in their orientation. There's environmental theories that are critical in their orientation. There's a bunch of them. And there's tons of, university departments that are based on these nowadays that used to not exist. Okay? All the gender studies and race studies and all of those things really come out of critical theory. So that's important to understand. CRT isn't a standalone thing. Okay? It's one critical theory within a bigger umbrella. So what is critical theory? Well, critical theory basically says this. We're going to critique society. Hence the name, critical. Okay? We're going to critique society. We're going to re-examine society. We're going to re-examine Marxism to see what really is the conflict in society. Not so much economic anymore. Maybe it still is. But we've added all these other things to it. Cultural things. right? Internal identity, like gender, right? Race, and so forth. So all critical theories are oriented towards restructuring, destabilizing, deconstructing, critiquing society. Now, certainly there is a place to critique things, right? Luther critiqued the Catholic Church, did he not? And a large part of that was power-related, right? They were misusing and abusing power. Obviously, there were huge doctrinal and theological issues, right? But he didn't overlook the fact that power played a role in all that. So we should be able to critique and analyze carefully our own societies and the power dynamics within them. Our country has had many times that we've abused power, where systems of oppression have emerged. We could look at race-based segregation. We could look at government-run eugenics programs that our own country did. We could look at abortion through state-funded programs, right? So there is a role for critique, right? And I think Christians, we should especially be good at that, because we have an understanding of fallen human nature, which then means we're really going to be skeptical a lot of times of power, because what people do with power, right? So I don't want to say we shouldn't critique things at all, but what happens with critical theory is there's no grounding for such critiques in a proper understanding of humankind, or truth, or universal morality, right? So that's the difference. All it is critique. There's no grounding for those things, okay? And then it just sort of consumes itself. It critiques too much. It deconstructs everything. That's how we end up with what I'm calling a liquid world of plastic people. Critical theory, postmodernism, cultural Marxism, all these things that are being thrown around today deconstruct society and individuals to the point where you're left with nothing that's stable. Institutions have crumbled. Families and churches, universities and civic organizations, even nation states. But even more, the world itself seems to be crumbling, and also seems to be something that's just material stuff that we can manipulate according to the power of our own technology and will. And here's where the industrial and digital revolutions play a role too. It's easy to view the world as liquid when we can control it and manipulate through industrial technologies and through digital technologies. So let's just do a little comparison to the way we view the world today because of those technologies, compared to a medieval peasant. Okay? For the medieval peasant who labored in the fields day by day with the work of his hands, his status was assigned by social custom. The boundaries of his world were defined by the transportation and communication technologies of his day. And the practices of daily medieval living included confrontation with materiality, with the world, with the weather, constantly encountering the constraints of nature, frequently experiencing limitations of movement and transportation, and also the fact that he was stuck in a social role. Now imagine telling that medieval person to live your truth, to follow your dreams, to choose your gender. It wouldn't make sense because of the world he was in, right? Now compare that to our world, where many days we don't even have to encounter nature. We're inside, we get in our car, which is in the garage, right? We push the garage door, we go out, right? We walk into our office, and you see what I'm saying? We have a very different relationship to nature because of the world we live in, right? And I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying we have to think about what that does to the way we think about ourselves and the world. Think about technology as well, right? With the push of a button, we can do things that people in the past could have never imagined they could do. What does that do to the way we think about ourselves and our autonomy and our power, right? So the habits of living, the things we have technologically as a society, impact how we think about ourselves and the world. Okay? That's a really key point. So we have way more choices than that medieval peasant. The going to the grocery store can be an identity crisis. There's too many choices. I remember when I came back from Malawi. I was there for 6 weeks after college. I was teaching in a village school. And the first time I went to a grocery store afterwards, I just had to walk out. Because there was so much stuff. I mean, think of the way we choose cars, right? Anything. TV channels, internet providers, anything. There's so many choices. So what does that do? It reinforces the idea that we control things, right? That we have choice, that we have autonomy, even in things we should not have choice about. So that's the kicker, right? Because we get used to choice, then the choices start to go into realms that we shouldn't have choice about. So this is why I think critical theory and so forth is so pervasive today. Not because everybody's read Marx or Foucault or critical theory, but because the habits of living that we experience every day, the social practices, the entertainment, the media, and so forth, they've already made the argument for us. These things are assumed as normal, even if we've never read a lick of philosophy. Our power over nature makes the world seem liquid, and our experiences of personal autonomy make people seem plastic. Now, on this point of plastic people, I'm going to draw heavily on Carl Trueman and his recent book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He looks at where we're at today, and he traces how we got here through three main stages. First, he says the self has been psychologized, then psychology was sexualized, then sex was politicized. Trueman argues that the first key to understanding how people view themselves today is to realize that we have psychologized ourselves. That my inner life, my feelings are the real me. And I must express those things to be an authentic person. Trueman points to the Romantic era after the Enlightenment with figures like Rousseau, who focused on self-expression, passion, and finding personal happiness through fulfilling inner desires. Not to fulfill their duties or responsibilities, but to express themselves freely, uninhibited by society's limitations, cultural taboos, or external authority, whether God, family, or tradition. And once those inner desires define what it means to be a person, well, what are usually the strongest of human desires? Sexual desires. Enter Freud and Darwin. Freud sexualized psychology by viewing the human psyche through the lens of sexual development. Though Freud did maintain the importance of suppressing sexual desire. But as Darwin's theory of evolution spread around the same time, there was no longer any reason to suppress those desires. What is natural is good. Following your instincts is good. Evolutionary origins opened the floodgates to uninhibited desire by obliterating the divine and unique creation of human beings. Remaining limits on sexual behavior crumbled as Darwin's theory was applied to human society, social Darwinism, which justified significant immorality in all types of areas of society. Racism, corporate greed, eugenics, imperialism, sexual transgression, many of those things can be tied back to social Darwinism, applying evolutionary theory to human cultures and societies. Now, when you add Freud and Darwin together, you have a strong undermining of traditional morality, but also a new sense of what it means to be a person. That my sexual expression is who I am. That what one does sexually is who one is. So if the psychologized self, the first stage, looking to the internal, right? If that said that internal self-expression is the highest good, then the sexualized self enshrines sexual self-expression as the highest good. Sex is not a behavior or an activity anymore. It's an identity. This is why it's seen as so bigoted to critique any sexual deviance, because it's who I am. Now to the third stage, sex being politicized. Sexual identity has become political and public identity to be celebrated, affirmed, accepted, both politically and culturally, because it's now categorized as rights. And you have spent any time with teens today. These new identities are attractive. Many teens think traditional heterosexuality is downright boring, even oppressive. Hetero is vanilla, dull, uninteresting. Give me something new. Gay, lesbian, bi, poly, non-binary, androgynous, trans, BDSM, queer. And you don't even want to think about some of the other identities on offer, which push the limits of transgression even further. This last stage of politicizing sex and sexual identity is also where Marx and these new philosophies also come together. So I'm going to try to explain this again and see if that'll help put the pieces together here. Again, Marx said the vision of material economic forces driving history were driving to revolution, where the workers going to overthrow the owners, right? But again, that wasn't happening. And when it did, it failed. Enter these new theorists, Frankfurt School theorists. Marcuse especially plays a role here in synthesizing Marx and his economic view of history with Freud and his sexual psychoanalysis. So Marcuse sort of melds the two in an interesting way and says that repressed sexual desire was part of the class struggle, especially the struggle not necessarily economically between bosses and workers, but in the repression of women within the family. So sexual repression is a tool of control used by societies to accumulate power and wealth, and the main tool to do that is the family. So Marcuse takes Marx's critique of the family, which already existed, he takes it further, as a patriarchal, unjust institution that sexually represses women, controls them, and limits their freedom. And key to the hoped-for revolution is obliterating these old codes and replacing them with unbounded sexual expression, which will dismantle the power structures. This is quite a move, and has been reverberating ever since. Cue the sexual revolution. Marcuse's core insight was that in capitalist consumer societies, which were growing so rapidly after World War II, a proletariat revolution of workers on economic terms ain't happening. Why? Well, because people were happy buying TVs and cars and homes and having a good job. Right? There were rising wages, the economy was growing. There's not going to be an economic revolution when that's happening. Where's the revolution going to come from? Where's the revolutionary self-consciousness going to come from? Sex. Any attempt to limit one's sexual expression becomes seen as oppression. Transgenderism is exhibit A for this whole trajectory that Truman lays out, these three stages, right? Psychologized, sexualized, politicized selves. Think about it. If my key to happiness is my internal self-expression, then I can be whoever I want to be. No external authority, no moral standards, no God, not even my own body can tell me otherwise. Because this is who I am. And you better celebrate it, bigot. But things aren't stopping here. There's another stage unfolding too, what I call the digitized self, which makes people even more plastic, constantly able to shape their precise identity the way they desire. The immersive digital habitat in which we live nudges us towards this digitized understanding of the self, where we have differing strains of identity that we can construct and curate and line up just the way we want online. We choose our friends. We choose our profiles. We choose our social media personas. We curate our feeds. We perfect our profiles. All of which makes this whole messaging surrounding the self as a constructed thing by the self increasingly attractive. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges as the allure of the digital world continues to grow and continues to become more immersive. When the body's physical characteristics are less central to everyday living, when we hardly ever swing a hammer or turn a wrench, when we hardly ever thread the needle or butcher an animal, the capabilities and limits of our bodies don't seem to matter much. As the human and digital blend further in what's called transhumanism, we are further alienated from our bodies, the bodies of others, and the world around us. And I predict that transgenderism and transhumanism will continue to merge and combine to transcend current limitations. Transspeciesism, zoophilia, animal identities. These are all dancing on the fringes already. I think the connection between transgenderism and transhumanism is an interesting one. Because if you think about it, transhumanism is the bigger idea. Transgenderism is just applying that to gender. Right? Transhumanism is sort of the big umbrella. Transgenderism might be a subset of that. Now, the next step, I think, is to go beyond pointing the finger at those people over there, right? We've also fallen prey to these ideas subtly in a variety of ways. We, too, assume choice as normal. We assume autonomy in many cases. Internet habits and screen time for Christians frequently mirror popular culture. Research suggests that sexual habits for many Christians don't look that different than non-Christians. David Ayers has a recent book called After the Revolution, which he documents younger Christians' opinions on sexual matters, and they increasingly mirror popular culture on a variety of points. One of the most interesting statistics that he quotes that I think is surprising too is this, quote, "Homeschooled and parochial schooled kids, when they go to college, are as likely to identify as LBGT as those from public or private school backgrounds. This shows us there's no magic solution and reveals just how immensely powerful the general culture is, especially through the allure of social media, smartphones, and entertainment. Kids aren't just watching harmless cat videos on YouTube. They're being formed. They're learning a way to be in the world. Research also shows that many Christians in America have bought into this psychologized idea, especially when it comes to God and religion. That God's main goal is for them to be happy and express themselves. That I'm nice, you're nice, and God's nice too. Christianity has become psychologized. Jesus, as my personal Savior, in my heart, my best friend, brings me fulfillment, makes my life better. This is called moralistic therapeutic deism, a term coined by Christian Smith, Notre Dame sociologist. God helps me be my true self, and then he'll just leave me alone. All of this means we have serious work to do. And Truman has another point worth mentioning. Quote, "Older Christians can no longer assume that biblical ethics make sense to younger Christians because the social imaginary in which they operate is so different to the one many of us grew up in. And that means we need to work harder at explaining not simply the content, but also the rationale of Christian morality. And there's currently nothing more powerful in shaping the moral imagination of millions of young people than TikTok, Instagram, and entertainment. What is our counter formation? What teaching are we providing? What habits are we forming that enables us to face this alluring world? How can we help them navigate it? How can we ourselves navigate it? There's no way to fully isolate from the temptations. How can we make the temptations not so tempting? To that we'll turn in part 3. Before the last part, any questions or clarifications on part 2, where we talked about critical theories, this idea of critiquing society in every way possible, okay? And then also this idea of the self and the trajectory that Carl Trueman lays out, where we go from sort of a psychologized to sexualized to politicized and then I added in digitized self. Any questions or clarifications on that? Yes, Frank?
Josh, did some of this start back in the 60s with the hippies?
So Marcuse,
As you were talking, I could see the flower children now.
yep, you definitely can connect to the 60s, sexual revolution, all of those things. Yeah, Marcuse was very influential in that whole era. He was the main theorist that they
I
were
was in
looking
my 20s then,
Yeah.
maybe closer to 30, but
Yep.
I can still see it again.
Yeah, it's a rolling revolution. The sexual revolution just keeps rolling, right? Like a snowball going down the hill, right? Once it gets this big, then it gets bigger with a new thing, and a bigger with a new thing, right? It's a rolling revolution.
Were some of those seeds developed in the 1930s, the pre-World War II era?
Yeah, that I remember.
Some of these.
For sure. Yeah, in between the world wars, you have like a precursor to the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
the one.
Yeah, John.
Can you give a couple more, maybe some harder examples of how we, I think that would be helpful.
Okay, more specific examples on that?
Yeah.
The psychologization of the self. Okay.
Can you...
Somebody want to give me another? Yeah.
With that,
Repeat the question.
Maybe add in with the whole my personal experience with Jesus, improving my personal relationship, because you brought that up. Being a part of that.
Yeah. All right, so we've got two questions here. The psychologized self, some other examples. All right, so we talked about Rousseau, the idea of self-expression and internal self-expression. Are you wanting more philosophers or more concrete examples of how we see that today?
It would be helpful to provide some more concrete examples that people could relate to. Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally what I'm doing.
Yeah, okay. Well, how about that list of phrases I gave earlier, right? Live your truth. I do me, you do you. Lived experience is another very big one today. That one's lived experience determines my truth, right? My truth is another very common one. I'm sure some of you could add some other examples. Sometimes on the fly, I'm not the best. So if anybody has better examples than I just gave, please jump in.
My perception is my reality.
Ah, good one. My perception is my reality. Any other ones?
If you're not part of my group, you have no right to critique or say anything.
Yes, that's called standpoint epistemology. Right? That my standpoint determines knowledge, epistemology, how I know things. And because you're not sharing my standpoint, you don't know what I know. Right? So it puts up a wall between groups. Right? That's very common, especially with marginalized groups and minorities, claiming that their standpoint gives them like a privilege. It gives them an epistemological privilege, that they have an insight to truth that other people can't know unless they share certain external and internal characteristics with them.
The accusations of cultural appropriation, that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, that would be sort of the reverse of that, right? Where you've got people who are claiming, standpoint epistemology, people who are culturally appropriating things.
Yeah. Like you
The
can't do that.
argument would be, hey, you can't do that because that's not your experience. Yeah. Any other concrete examples? That's good.
So
Yep.
to that point, then, would that actually incentivize kids going to college in order to be able to have a particular right standpoint, to be able to say I've got knowledge on something, to go into a gender queer, LGBTQIA plus whatever.
Totally. On the gender question, this is a big reason that white, middle, upper class kids take on a non-binary gender. It's a way to identify with the oppressed. Okay? It's a way to get your oppressed badge. Okay? That's a big part of it. That for the white, middle class, or upper class person, they're always the oppressor. But they can get away from that by taking on a marginalized status. And one way to do that, probably the clearest way today, would be to take on a non-binary gender.
I think the other thing to add into this as well, is what you're saying, is this idea of sort of making the world liquid and people plastic is actually the goal, and that they want people to be destabilized in their identities and in their understanding of the world, and that's actually the goal.
Yeah, it's, when you look at critical theorists like a Marcuse or a Gramsci, it is a deconstruction of everything, destabilization of everything. Yeah.
And basically with that the idea that if everything is destabilized, well, people who are destabilized are easier to control. And that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so then your question was about the psychologized religion aspect?
Yeah.
More examples of that? Or?
No, I guess that I don't really have a good understanding of when people say that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe from your perspective, what do you get out of that? I mean, is that something that you've asked people? What does that mean? Or
Well, I sort of grew up in that. I was in the evangelical world for a while before becoming Reformed, before becoming Lutheran. So I used to talk in that language when I was, a kid, and asked Jesus into my heart many times because I wasn't sure. So yeah, it's an uphill battle because it's so ingrained. I would say that the main things that helped convince me of why that doesn't work is because it's all subjective. That it either leads to pride because you really have a relationship with Jesus and you're buddies with him and things are going well and he's communicating with you and guiding you and the Spirit's leading you, or it leads to despair because you're not experiencing those things, right? So I think Luther's classic, falling off the horse, either to pride or despair, is helpful in helping people realize that doesn't work in the long run, especially when things aren't going well. Right? So maybe put a little pebble in their shoe, right? And over time, they'll come to maybe realize that. But I think that's the real problem with it all. It's all subjective, which leads to one of those two twin evils of pride or despair. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. All right. So let's try to wrap up here quickly. I think I'll shorten some of the last. Yes, sir. Did you say 10 minutes or did I need to wrap up? I'm fine either way.
Just comments
That's right.
on part 2,
Yep.
Roman numeral 2.
Okay.
We go from the psychologized to psychology, and sexualized to sex, and then politicized.
Yep.
How do we get to well, let me just make my statement first. I think sex is I think you're absolutely correct about the politicization of it, but they are so militant, and it's a weapon that if we do not abide,
You're inferior.
but what I don't understand, well, I guess it's because there's no, and I guess my process is just linear. I don't understand why they don't understand that they are the ones who are violent against me, who have accused me of being violent, verbally. And I don't mean abusive language,
Right.
just for the sake of, I'm not sorry, you're wrong.
Right. Right. Well, that gets to the idea that words themselves can be violence, right? That's part of this whole thing as well, that words have power, but then the actual violence in the streets isn't real violence, right?
The very people who are nonconformists demand conformity, and that they be legitimized and force us to open up our streets literally and parade up and down, and it's legal. Anyway.
Yeah, that's certainly very true and inconsistent. In the name of tolerance, they're not tolerating.
And that's part of the Marxist construct, is it not? Of just kind of like overthrowing the oppression of, well, you have this gender and, these chromosomes, and so their attempt to overthrow is in fact militant in the fact that it's trying to overthrow the
There's
white
definitely
cis
a revolutionary aspect to that. Yep, for sure. Good stuff. Okay, well, yeah, Katie.
I think part of that is part of the making your own truth. You're never going to have any consistency if the whole Culture is everyone's making their own truths. There's nothing to mainstream anybody, right?
Yep.
So one minute it is going to be too much, next minute it's not. And I think that's what ends up feeding that hypocrisy that we all feel.
Yep.
Is because we have more consistency across the board,
Yep.
and they don't. Changes
Yep.
day to day.
Yeah. Yep. That's good. Yeah, you did.
The Make Your Own Truth community seems to have an almost blind anger against the old Christian ways and just seek to dismantle every one of them in wherever they find them.
Yeah, they also are upset with people who aren't Christian that critique their ideas too. There's divisions within the LGBT alphabet, right? They don't all agree, especially in relation to the T, okay? Because for gays and lesbians and traditional feminists, actual gendered embodiment mattered, right? Okay? It mattered a huge deal. Your chromosomes matter. The T says they don't. So there's an inherent battle within the alphabet, okay? There's the term TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. There's a good number of feminists who critique transgender, okay? And then they get bashed, too, as TERFs.
Truly an unlikely ally in this war.
Alliances and coalitions are very interesting in our culture today. And there's some people who have nothing to do with Christianity that are willing to take a stand for truth and be bold and have gotten fired. And they are doing a lot of good on some of these matters. I think we're going to have some interesting coalitions. Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Fran.
Now, the church should not be silent, and we are on a lot of these matters.
Right. On that note, let me try to wrap up with some of these points that get to that. Okay? Great stuff. Good stuff. That's the whole idea, right? Strategy session. All right. Good questions. So let's try to tie this together. 5 minutes? All right. Okay. So first off, we can't just say no. Okay? We're not just against something. We have to shape our consciences and our moral imagination around a positive model. We have to provide a superior yes, and also critique the ideas from the inside. Now, we already critiqued the ideas from the inside a little bit, so I'm going to skip that. If you want to talk later about that, we can. I just had some examples of how it's very dualistic. This view of the self is very dualistic, where you've got your internal self and your body that's separate from it, right? That's a very Gnostic, dualistic way of viewing the human person. I had a point about also there's limits to self-construction. There's limits to constructivism because it deconstructs too much, sort of like Katie was saying, with truth always being determined by you. There's nothing stable. But now let's look at a few things where Christianity, I think, provides a compelling alternative. First, if we think about power dynamics, right, in wokeness, Christianity is the exact opposite. Christ willingly gives up his power, empties himself, and takes on the form of a servant, right? Philippians 2. The most powerful event in history was the powerless, crucified God. Christ turns power dynamics on its head. Second, Christianity offers a rich picture of embodiment as pure gift. Certainly in a fallen world, there's going to be brokenness in connection with bodily life. But Christianity treasures the goodness of the body and makes sense of that brokenness by situating it in the flow of creation, fall, redemption, recreation. Similarly, too, Christianity celebrates the goodness of sexed embodiment and the goodness of sex, too. Christian sexual ethics are not just a list of do's and don'ts. Christians aren't prudish people who squirm when someone says sex. Sex is not dirty or shameful. It received our Lord's Edenic pronouncement of very good. The triune God gives a resounding yes to human sexuality and uses imagery of intimate knowing to refer to intertrinitarian communion and to Christ and the church. When situated in the proper context of male-female marriage, sex retains its beauty, honor, joy, and purpose. We also see in our male and female bodies differences that are not just accidents of biology, but are beautiful, mysterious, and complementary, revealing something profound about what it means to be human. I think here we do need to be careful and clear, though. What we're not saying is a replay of old male-female stereotypes. It's actually LGBT ideology that doubles down on stereotypes. They say if you have a female body but like boy things, you must really be a boy. Right? We don't want to repristinate those old, dated stereotypes that many times weren't really what reality was anyway. Way too simplistic. Being a Christian woman doesn't mean one has to like sewing, cooking, and flowers. Being a Christian man doesn't mean I have to like trucks, monster trucks, guns, and never cry. Tell that to Paul, who wept before his congregations and in his prayers. Acts 20, 2 Timothy 1:4. So we have a profound and countercultural message. And that can come through when we realize that male-female embodiment, that the different body parts we have are part of an overall structure of the body that has a telos, that has a goal, that points somewhere, points to each other, actually, and the procreative potential expressed in our sexed bodies. Whether a man likes pink or blue, ballet or baseball, or all of the above, he really is a man. Whether a woman likes Air Jordans or Jane Austen, NASCAR or Nutcracker, all of the above, or all of the above, she really is a woman. That's the vision we need to give teen boys and girls. This vision of givenness, generativity, and life that awaits them on the other side of the tumultuous years of puberty. When they have a grounding in the givenness of gender, the beauty of womanhood, the self-giving love of true manhood, they can see their destiny. We have to shape and form a moral imagination not driven by sexualization or objectification with its short-lived pleasures, but oriented towards lasting joy in marital love and marriage to Christ. We can see beyond the fleeting pleasures of a near bestial view of sexuality peddled by popular culture today when we realize that what we can say yes to is far better. The deep and lasting fulfillment found in faithful monogamy, which allows erotic love its fullest expression and brings eros to its proper fulfillment in agape. One other point as we close. Christianity goes further even than this. Humans are not just creatures of God, we commune with God. We are built for union with the divine, eternally seen in the interpenetrating and intercoursing love within the Trinity, and in God's self-giving love to Adam and Eve. Now, post-fall, this is renewed in Christ as we are united to him by faith, declared righteous and regenerated, made into new creatures who are now intimately connected to God once again. We would do well to recover the unio mystic, our real union with Christ, which is not something just in our heads or in our hearts or in our feelings. It is real, objectively in the historic Christ event and subjectively made ours through the spoken and sacramental mysteries. Yes, imputation of Christ's righteousness and forensic justification should be proclaimed as loud as ever. But we should not overlook another central aspect of New Testament teaching that informs our life in Christ. Namely, that our union with Christ, in that we become partakers of the divine nature. We are new creatures, whose hearts of stone have been made into hearts of flesh. As those who live in the kingdom inaugurated by Christ, we have new allegiances to King Jesus, who has regenerated our hearts and is reordering our desires towards the summum bonum, the highest good, Christ himself. Messiah rules and reigns not from a distant throne, but as he breaks into time and space in baptism, word, and supper, reminding us of our lasting identity. Not a constructed identity, but a God-given identity. Renewing, remaking, preparing us for our final destiny in the marriage of Christ and his bride on the last day. This is the true story of the world. Not a story based on power dynamics, but based on the paradoxical, upside-down, subversive powerlessness of Christ the crucified. That word of the cross, which is the dynamis, the power dynamics of God. Thank you. Yeah.
You had contrasted two teaching styles at the very beginning.
Sage on stage, guide on side.
Yeah, guide on the side. And one of the things that right at in your last point about Christ, I've heard from other sources that are somewhat more Christian influences, servant leadership as a better expression of guide on the side, better than guide on the side. Have you considered that in the application section of it? I know
in using the phrase, I know I'm simplifying, right? As a teacher, as a parent, there's going to be times where you do step aside, right? Like teaching the kid to ride the bike, right? For a while you hold on, eventually you let go, right? So it's not that there's no place for the side. It's just that juxtaposition in the way it comes through education basically contributes to teachers letting kids determine truth, basically. It's a very, what happens is the teacher just becomes like the neutral referee. But yeah, I mean,
Like going too far.
yeah, servant leadership within a Christian context, yeah, I think there's certainly a place for that. Yeah, Tim.
I just am concerned about your comments around masculine and feminine stereotypes.
Yeah.
You know, I always thought boys' sort of natural interest in schools and football and guns and wrestling, that prepares them for these God-given roles of providing for their families and protecting their communities. You know, but if you reduce that to just a dated stereotype, you know, that could be concerning, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's a good clarification, right? What I'm trying to avoid is idealizing a sort of a 1950s image of masculine and feminine, which was really a short-lived image, historically speaking, and had some problems to it. No, but it's a valid point, yeah. From the time a baby is born, boys and girls are different, and any parent can attest to that, right? So I'm not saying there's no differences, but what I'm trying to say, though, too, is that we don't make those differences so pronounced that we end up with two human essences, two human natures, which is Aristotle's problem, okay? Aristotle said there's two human natures. There's a male human nature or human essence, and there's a female human essence, okay? We share one common human nature. So maybe I'm foreseeing a possible issue that we've not arrived at yet, maybe. Yeah, it's a valid point. Valid point. Thank you. Anything else? Questions, comments? Yeah.
I can kind of caveat on that though, so I was a single mom to my two kids, so what they saw and what they kind of embodied as we were growing up, yes, I shoot guns, I was in the army and did all that stuff, but they also were exposed more to things that I did, like riding horses, and they were obviously involved with cooking and cleaning because I did it by myself. So while they showed a desire to cook or do certain things, it wasn't taking, my son doesn't feel like he's a girl, he gets asked that at his doctor's appointments, but he still has a desire to shoot and do those things, but it's not enforced that you're not a man if you like to cook, or you're not a man if you don't do X, Y, and Z, which I think is where those stereotypes come in, is not demasculating him by saying, oh, because you like to cook, you're a wuss, or you're a girl, or you throw like a girl, or you do these things like a girl. But recognizing, yes, you're a boy, and it's okay to like to cook, or it's okay to like to sew. My husband likes to sew. He's really good at sewing. I make him sew my buttons on my uniforms. But does he like to sit and make quilts? No. But there are things where it's cooking and cleaning and sewing are not bad things to teach men, but I think that stereotype definitely does affect them when you put that line in of demasculating them for taking an interest in those things.
Other questions?
To build off that, some of the dangers in that, when you try to put some behavioral things in interest, doesn't that just start picking people off creating weaknesses that you can then use to exploit people, to say, oh, you need to be, you're not a real man, so you may be a man that will tie your sexual expression to interest, as opposed to just letting your sexual identity as God created man and woman be separate from other interests. I think that's what says the point. And we fall into a trap if we say that a girl who likes to shoot guns might be a lesbian. Right?
Yeah, it's like taking it too far.
Reminds me of the story of Dr. Seuss, the Sneaker story.
Other questions, comments, thoughts, critiques, please. I'd love to hear if you have a challenge to anything I've said, like Tim did. It was a good clarification. Pastor Olson.
Challenge, thank you very much. You know, I've been reading a little bit about Mao through his medical doctor who kept him for about 40 years. Good period. Mao understood that in order to have a revolution, you had to use the youth, because only they would rebel against traditions which were so strong. And it just seems this whole idea of sexualized, politicized, is paying off big time for those who seek revolution. Because it's like they put together the two things that are, I mean, what energizes the youth more than sex? And especially at that age, as Luther was pointing out. It just, very fascinating, you know, we heard about Freud back in the college days, but there was something to this whole matter of sexuality and how it's been used and abused. It's really awful. Yeah. And in our schools is where a lot is taking place.
Right.
I mean, is it anything other than stupid that a young man can sit in class and watch porn on a computer that's provided by the school? And this is allowed because if we don't allow that, they can't get to something else that has some good in it. I mean, we've gone over it yet.
Other questions? Thank you, Pastor. Yes, sir.
I guess kind of along those lines, I just look at this and I just think, we're in trouble. I mean, we have a compelling story, but it's almost like, as compelling as it is, isn't it can be threatening too? I mean, if the whole culture sees or starts to see things in this power dynamic, and these ideas represent oppression, I mean, where are we at? I mean, is there any room for hope with that in terms of,
right?
You know?
Yeah, we'll get more into that tomorrow, with the next two sessions. I guess at this point I'd say that I think we're going to have to view our role more as like a creative minority in society. And that strong, local, resilient communities of Christians and churches are going to be what's going to, bit by bit, make an impact. That'd be my take on it. So, yeah, it's a good question. Yep.
Who is more oppressed than Christians? Aliens on this earth.
There have been a lot of martyrdoms in the last 100 years. Not in America. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention and contributions for the first session. I guess we'll head over to the chapel.